Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the ideas put forward in a newspaper article this week on how Boris Johnson could make a very unlikely return to Downing Street before the election, meaning that the Conservatives would have had 3 leadership contests inside the span of a single parliament. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So for the record, I don't think this is at all likely. I don't think Boris Johnson has repaired his public image. He certainly hasn't learned to be more discreet. In fact, if he did make a spectacular return as Prime Minister later this year, it would feed his ego to the point where, if anything, he would be even more reckless than he was before. I see little sign that the majority of Tory MPs relish that prospect, even though a very large minority potentially do. But when something is purely about politics, anything can happen. There is genuine political gravity when there's no way to avoid consequences, but that really occurs when it's impossible to hide the real world consequences of a policy or an action from the public. You know, when politics strays into other areas, there are boundaries. Like Boris Johnson did not get away with his libertarian take it on the chin claptrap when the pandemic hit in 2020. Yes, he's not been held accountable for the damage he caused, but that's because his PR strategy worked on the public. But he still had to observe boundaries. Liz Truss did not get away with her mini budget because there are rules in economics just like there are in medicine. And she was held accountable because she made no attempt to play the PR game. For example, we've been suffering the economic consequences of Tory policies for over a decade. There are consequences to austerity, but they have still won 3 general elections since. This is because they hid the link between the damage and their policies. Truss didn't do that, and so political gravity caused her to hit the ground. But when something is purely political, when it doesn't stray outside of politics, anything can happen. No such thing as impossible, only improbable or likely. Who leads a political party, for example? Purely a matter of politics. I say that I am confident that Sunak will only be replaced as leader after the election and that it's very unlikely to be Boris Johnson again. That even if Sunak's government is fatally weakened this year, I think Tory MPs are probably going to be more likely to want to see a general election than to try and bring Boris Johnson back. But that is my reading of Conservative MPs. If I'm wrong, or if they change their outlook, all bets are off. The Conservatives can do what they like with the office of Prime Minister. They've got a majority in Parliament. They can change the Prime Minister every month if they like. And at one point we're doing. I mean, I half expect them to give me a call to ask if I'd be interested, although they'd have to appoint me to the House of Lords first. Also, I'm not living in London, sod that. If they want me, they can move Parliament to Doncaster. But right now, the reason I do not think that MPs will drop Sunak and go for another leader is because I think they view him as their best chance at the next election. But if a majority of Tory MPs think that Boris Johnson would suddenly do better, well, could happen. They don't even need to think that Sunak will definitely lose and Johnson will definitely win. They just have to think that Johnson will lose fewer seats than Sunak. Last year, you would never have considered that. It was viewed that Sunak, yes, might lose the election. It might be too far gone, but that Johnson would lose it by a lot. Like Rishi Sunak might lose you 100 seats. Boris Johnson might lose you 150 or 200. Too much to come back from, after a term of Labour government. But Johnson has some influential backers, some very noisy backers, in both the party and the media. And they have been busy trying to rewrite history ever since Johnson fell. There was a piece in the newspaper yesterday. It details the thinking of some Conservative allies of Johnson in terms of a possible return. And I read it and I noted, well, you seem to be missing some important details out here and got other things wrong as well. But that doesn't matter. What matters is what Tory MPs think. Their perception is all that matters because this is a purely political matter. If Tory MPs think that Sunak is not as strong as they thought he would be, or that Johnson has repaired his public image with some time on the back benches, then the switch is back on. And they could be wrong. Like, people thought Matt Hancock had repaired his public image because he got to the final of the Celebrity Get Me Out of Here. And then I looked at the polling afterwards, and actually, in terms of public polling, it was where it was. And his book didn't sell this Christmas. That was a bit of an indicator as well. So, you can be misled into thinking you've repaired a public image when you haven't. But all the perception is all that matters. Like, personally, I think it would be playing into Labour's hands. Not only would Starmer get the clown back to contrast his own dependable image, but the Tories would be indulging in yet another leadership battle as we sink further into recession. We're entering a very deep recession this year. Any internal party politicking from the Tories will make it really easy to see themselves as utterly selfish, unable to consider the national interest. And that hit them in the polls last year during the first Tory leadership contest, when everyone else was calling for them, to come together and sort out the energy package, and they wouldn't do. What's it going to be like this year as they squabble about who should sit on the throne when everyone else is suffering? But that's what I think. What do Tory MPs think? I was discussing earlier today the upset that the government will have caused by briefing a journalist that they were prepared to water down the retained EU laws bill. If any far-right Brexiteers think that they won't be able to persuade Sunak to change his mind on that one, but they do think that Johnson will go ahead with it, then yeah, they'll be prepared to change leader, although they'll have to work quickly before the bill is passed into law, I think. The question is, do they feel confident that Johnson would force the bill through, unamended? And would they be able to get him reappointed in time to do so? But in this article anyway, it presents the view that Truss imploded and Sunak may perform badly at the local elections next year, which is fairly certain. The implication may well be that if Sunak seems to have failed, then Johnson has no other rivals for the leadership. Has to be noted that Boris Johnson withdrew from the second leadership contest when he did, in the end, have enough nominations to go through. It is possible that he thought he'd never get MPs on side while they thought Sunak would be better off. So he'd constantly be fighting a fractured party. So he pulled out, gives Sunak the chance to implode himself, just like Liz Truss did. Obviously, he's not actually going to go out with a bang like Truss. He's not as reckless. In fact, he's not reckless at all. But he may struggle to close the gap in the polls for enough MPs to think he can chart a course to election victory. The local elections will also be a very bruising affair for Sunak. It is possible to limit the damage with an intelligent campaign, but nothing will be enough for Johnson's backers. They will claim anything is a disastrous result. The article quoted a friend of Johnson's, who's also a Tory MP, they didn't say who divined that the two crucial factors for Johnson this year will be how he handles the COVID inquiry and how the local elections go for Sunak. Are those really the two crucial factors? No mention, you notice, of the ongoing Partygate lies inquiry. Even if Boris Johnson gets to remain an MP once that's concluded, he's still likely to be on record as having lied to Parliament about it. It'll bring Partygate back to public attention. There'll be more stories in the newspapers. Any hope Johnson has in making his frontline return to politics rests mostly on his ability to convince his MPs that he has rehabilitated his public image. Now, it's quite true that he needs to avoid the public seeing just how badly he handled the pandemic, but I've got a fair amount of confidence that the Tories will fiddle the inquiry. That is, frankly, the least of his worries. The only way Johnson's going to trip up over the COVID inquiry is if there are enough knives out for him within the Conservative Parliamentary Party, and if that is the case, he's on to a loser coming back as Prime Minister anyway. This is a clear attempt by a self-proclaimed ally of Boris Johnson to frame the debate on areas of strength for their man. But there are other factors as well. The first is, as I say, the Privileges Committee inquiry. It's a massive one. He might not even be an MP after it. The second is whether a majority of Tory MPs are prepared to back Johnson to replace Sunak. As long as Sunak has a majority of MPs thinking he is at least the best of a bad choice, Johnson gets nowhere. The third is how the public reacts. After wounds are poked with the Privileges Committee conclusion when it eventually comes and the COVID inquiry, How are members of the public going to react to the idea that Boris Johnson could come back as the conquering hero again? We know that people took a dim view when he tried to come back after Liz Truss's fall. You know, I mean, is a few more months really going to get the public to forget about all that? The same public who abandoned him during those by-elections in those safe Tory seats in 2021. Again, there's an absence of discussion about that. The fact that Boris Johnson was not just doing badly in the polls, he was losing safe Tory seats as leader. This idea that he's an election winning machine is like, is this still valid? He was losing safe seats. That is a bit of a stretch. The fourth consideration is whether it poses a benefit or a challenge to Labour. It's all right, the Conservatives thinking about what they would like. You also have to think in terms of your opponent. What would Labour like? Do they prefer Johnson or Sunak? They're going to have to ask themselves that. It has to be said, Sunak's done his job for the Tories so far. Yes, he's been bad in interviews, photo opportunities and PMQs, but he has dialed the political news right down. Sunak's job was to come in and make government boring in order that fewer people were paying attention to the political news, because the political news is not good. You know, I would say he's done that. With Sunak, you don't get the spectacle or the insanity of Johnson or Truss. Right now, the Tories want to distract attention away from themselves. Boris Johnson draws attention. Sunak is diverting attention away because no one... You try and listen to him. What? What's he just said? I'm watching something else. You know, the opposite would happen with Johnson. Yes, he has an appeal to voters who are important to the Conservatives, particularly in the Red Wall. But if they're going to lose those anyway, or if it's not enough, and he pisses off even more important voters elsewhere, he's still a net handicap to the party's chances. I struggle to see how even Tory MPs who feel that Sunak's going to lose the election, I can't imagine Tory MPs think that Sunak's going to win the next election. But I struggle to see how they think they'll do better with Johnson. Consider they hesitated for a very, very long time to remove Johnson. They waited far too long, in my opinion. And this was because they knew there was no obvious replacement. There wasn't someone waiting in the wings who was going to win that next election. When they made Sunak leader, it wasn't because they thought that he was going to win the election, but because he was the best they could manage to limit the damage. Expectations have never been high for Sunak. In his party, they've never had those. He's just there to calm things down a bit. So I really can't see them forgetting why it is they eventually dumped Johnson and bringing him back, especially when he is going to be insufferable if they bring him back. He's got such an ego. You know, he's there just waiting for them to come crawling back to him. Oh, do they really want to deal with that? That being said, if they would like to completely lose their minds and do that, far be it from me to object. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.